If people are quite binary, like I would say I am, then you do have to be prepared to learn, really, from other people and listen to their stories.
In this episode of Quakers Today, we hear from LGBTQ plus people about their experiences of faith, gender, and community. Reverend Dr. Tina Beardsley, one of the very first transgender priests in the Church of England, tells us about her journey and the challenges trans and non-binary people face in society and within the LGBTQ plus community. John Calvi, a Quaker healer and writer, is also a singer-songwriter. He shares with us the song he wrote during the HIV/AIDS crisis. Queer author Ryan La Sala chats with me about his new eco-horror book, The Dead of Summer. Ryan explains why scary stories are especially needed in horrible times. And you will hear audio I recorded a while ago at Southeastern Yearly Meeting. For me, it was a celebration of community that transcended traditional gender binaries. This is Season 5, Episode 7 of the Quakers Today podcast, a project of Friends Publishing Corporation. This season of Quakers Today is sponsored by the American Friends Service Committee and Friends Fiduciary. This episode was inspired by the March 2026 issue of Friends Journal, Gender and Sexual Identities. In his introduction, Martin Kelly frames the collection of articles as a vital check-in on a recurring theme, how Quaker communities can move beyond just tolerating one another. How can we truly treasure each person by leaning into curiosity, uncovering lost queer history, and using spiritual tools like clearness committees to support the many ways friends long to be known and loved? As a storyteller and audio designer who happens to be gay, I decided to queer the Quakers Today podcast for this episode. That means it may sound different. I'm playing with sounds and music as part of the storytelling process. If you have earbuds or headphones, I totally encourage you to use them for the full experience. And this episode is longer than our typical ones, but don't worry, next episode will be our normal, shorter length. Also, I'm stepping outside the Quaker world to gain insights from another faith community, the Church of England. In a moment, you will hear my conversation with Reverend Dr. Tina Beardsley, an Anglican priest. But first, a heads up. This episode contains deep and moving stories. Some of them will be painful to hear. LGBTQ plus people have a long history of struggle and resilience, of inequity and liberation. It's easy to point out where governments and the wider society have oppressed LGBTQ plus people. But what about the discrimination and oppression some of us face from other LGBTQ plus people? Or from Quakers? Just like historical and contemporary queer experiences, this episode, will contain a mix of challenging and uplifting elements. So thank you for taking this ride with me today. Tina Beardsley is one of those people who surprises you. She's an Anglican priest, a theologian, and an openly trans woman. She's been doing the work long before it was safe or even imaginable to some. Tina was ordained way back in 1978 and spent over 20 years as a parish priest before moving into healthcare chaplaincy. She eventually headed up a multi-faith team at Chelsea and Westminster Hospital in London. All this while transitioning right in the thick of it when bishops were unsure and the church was, let's just say, not exactly ready. But Tina did it anyway.
If people are quite binary, like I would say I am, then you do have to be prepared to learn, really, from other people and listen to their stories. We evolve. Let's put it this way. I think I evolved in my understanding of myself. I guess I've come to a fairly sort of binary position where I see myself like as a woman with a trans history. And I can also recall being at Greenbelt, the Christian Arts Festival, a few years ago on a panel. I think were there 3 or 4 of us. I was the old one. A friend of mine was the middle-aged one, and then there was the young one, and they were non-binary. I couldn't see the audience because we had lights shining in our eyes, but our prep for this panel had been really fun. And I remember thinking, oh wow, the future is non-binary. I thought, this is amazing. Then I thought of the bishops who were all my age, and I thought, they're not going to like this one little bit. This particular priest, young priest, he had organised an event, and they'd invited a non-binary priest to speak. It proved very controversial indeed. Some of the pushback he got was actually from older gay male clergy who were known to have partners, but the partners never went to events, you didn't know their names. It was the friend who lived at the vicarage. But they were the most critical of this event. And somehow this non-binary priest proved a real trigger for them of something beyond their experience or something almost about shame, really. I'm not quite sure what it was.
This reminds me of some event that you and I were at that I think you invited me to, where it was Church of England queer clergy. And I remember I learned there about how cisgender gay men were some of the strongest opponents to the ordination of women.
Mm-hmm.
Am I remembering this correctly?
Yes, that group, it had been very well supported, but then it split. So when women were ordained and it was decided to admit lesbian clergy to that group left. Which is sad, really. I suppose they could see that women would be invited to celebrate Mass or whatever. Maybe that's why they went. It seemed that what we had in common as a group that was experiencing oppression in the church wasn't sufficient to keep the group together. One of the leading opponents of conversion therapy, Jane Ozanne, she has a national profile in encouraging a ban on conversion therapy here. She was an advisor on the LGBT advisory panel to the UK government, but she resigned. The reason she resigned was because they were not listening to the trans people on that group. The narrative there is that, yes, we've got to ban conversion therapy for lesbian and gay people, but actually they talk about transing the gay. This is the narrative. And I think what Jane was saying was they're not listening to trans people. The organisations they are listening to are the very gender critical groups. Trans people are reluctant to appear in the media and debate their own lives, or they're just not invited. You'll have television and radio discussions about these issues in inverted commas, and you won't hear a trans person's voice. Our media is incredibly gender critical. You know, the Times, the Sunday Times. I think somebody did a study and there were over 1,000 articles in 12 months about trans people. We're a tiny, tiny percentage of the UK population, and most of it is negative. So people are being drip fed this stuff all the time. You know, it's misinformation. It's not right. It's far-fetched, and it's far from our reality. It's just not true. But it's being said very persistently, persuasively, strongly, all the time. And so I think it's hard for people, if they're within those circles, to differentiate. So I think being very careful about what you say. Yeah, going back to critical, I think we have to be critical. The allies have to be critical of what's coming at them through mainstream media. I mean, there's a high-profile case in the UK where a young trans woman took her own life. The mother is a doctor, a very well-informed person about lots of medical things, but was repeating at the meal table the things she was reading in the media. The trans daughter had not come out. Now that the daughter has taken her own life, she carries enormous guilt for the things she said, ill-informed, not knowing what her daughter would be thinking, feeling. The UK population are pretty liberal on the whole around these sort of issues. They've either got somebody trans in their family, in their workplace, in their social circle, in their church. People are out nowadays in a way that they weren't in the past. So therefore, they're not going to be taken in by this stuff. But I think it is really hard if it's coming at you all the time. So understanding the misinformation. I mean, some people would say, don't read all this stuff in the paper. If your friends say things that are repeating it, challenge it. And this is where we need to approach it a little bit more compassionately. Because what we found was, and this is something you yourself have spoken about quite movingly, about your own childhood as well, that when you're young and your trajectory is you're going to be attracted to someone of the same sex, that isn't necessarily very obvious as a young person. What can be obvious is this gender nonconformity. And so some of these gay men will have experienced criticism, anger from parents, correction of behaviour because of their gender non-conforming patterns of speech or the way they played and so on.
I get that. I was bullied for being a sissy long before I realized I was gay. So I shoved everything in the closet. My orientation, sure, but also that soft, flamboyant, tender part of me. Years later, I came out as gay. But that sissy boy, he stayed gagged and bound deep inside. To be whole, to be strong, I had to go back for him. I had to rescue that sissy boy and make space for him in my adult life. I've heard gay men talk about trans women and non-binary folks with contempt, sometimes to their faces, but often behind their backs. And when I hear it, I wonder, are they actually just talking to the parts of themselves they still hate? The parts they were taught to hide or destroy? So many of us carry old wounds. And sometimes instead of healing them, we pass the pain along. A gay man who once got punished for being effeminate learns to hate anything that reminds him of that weakness. So he unloads that hate onto a trans woman or a femme gay man or anyone who dares to be both queer and free.
How can we talk about these things? Because we don't talk about them. And then it will come out in these distorted reactions and responses. When you hear what happens to people who are vulnerable, maybe because they are having to transition without hormones, and it's very obvious that they are not conforming to gender stereotypes, then they can be on the receiving end of verbal and even physical abuse. There are these people who are saying these negative things within the LGBT community, but in fact, the majority of LGBT people in the UK are affirming. This was proved at Pride when a small group tried to head up the parade with anti-trans banners and were removed. They do not represent the majority. They do not represent most people in Britain. It's just that they have very loud voices and, because of funding, access to the media.
That was Reverend Dr. Tina Beardsley, a priest, theologian, and co-author of the book Trans-Affirming Churches. Tina has been serving as an Anglican minister for nearly 50 years. March 2026 Gender and Sexual Identities issue of Friends Journal has a recurring theme. As we look at the present and future, we have the privilege of looking back to queer history and our LGBTQ plus elders. One of our queer Quaker elders is John Calvi. John Calvi is a queer Quaker elder and a healer who has spent decades releasing physical and emotional pain as a massage therapist specialized in trauma. Many of you may know him for his powerful witness against torture or through his books and his many contributions to Friends Journal. But John is also a musician. Dwight Dunstan, the host of the podcast The Seed, Conversations for Radical Hope, recently sat down with John to discuss his life and his song, The Ones Who Aren't Here. It's a tender, powerful piece of music that bridges the gap between those we've lost and the hope we carry forward.
Would love to hear more if you want to share about how art shows up in your life now. And I'm so grateful I got to listen to your song, The Ones Who Aren't Here, as a way to also ready myself for this conversation. I'm curious about the origins of that song for you, how that song speaks to you today, and what does it mean to carry memory and love across time and loss?
Yes, well, that song is very special in my life. I was in my 20s and I was not out to my family. Although I was so different and I was so gay that you really would have to be very committed to denial to not be able to see it. I was very different from everyone else in the family. What happened was one of my brothers outed me to my father, who was a violent alcoholic. He outed me while they were having a drunken argument in the bar that my father owned. So it was a perfect storm of sorts.
Mm-hmm.
I was told I could never come home again. And at the time, I was traveling around and singing at gay coffee houses, doing mostly my own music. And this song came to me There were so many people. There were so many people who would never get to a gay coffee house or a gay pride march or other places where they could experience gay community. This was a huge grief for me. While I was thrown out of my family, I confess that it wasn't that bad a family to get thrown out of. The separation actually was very helpful to me. But I'm thinking about the people who never made that leap. And so in writing that song, I was thinking about all of the people who were staying in the closet. And the closet is so fierce. It is so fiercely woven into the subconscious that we're not even aware often as to how strong that prison door is and how it can alter our thoughts and our perceptions. And so as you begin to lay down the various pieces and parts of the closet, this liberation continues and gets stronger and goes on. And I'm so happy that this song has traveled so widely to so many places and used in so many different kinds of events. It's used at weddings, it's used at memorials, is used at gay pride marches. The wonderful recording by Meg Christian, the wonderful recording by Suede, all very strong and very clear. When Suede was performing the song at first back in the late 80s, she would hand out a postcard that was addressed to President Reagan saying, please do more about the AIDS epidemic. That was such a fierce time. And so it began to be used as a political song, along with something that was very heartfelt. And when I hear it now, sometimes I think about how far the song has traveled. As Pete Seeger said, you build a good building, it can be used for a lot of different things over time. I heard it the other day while I was driving, and I just burst into tears to think about all the pain to go through to compose that song, because it starts out like a lot of good songs where you name the trouble and then you name the resolution. That's a very hopeful thing to do, but you have to go through hell to get there. There's another song on one of my songs on YouTube you can find called "The Little Gracefulness." It was recorded by a group called the Short Sisters, dear friends of mine. And it was all the rules I put together to be able to go into work in a crisis situation and do your best. That was also very helpful for me when I began working the AIDS wars back in 1983, when things were just so fierce. Putting together that song was a very good way for me to maintain my disciplines of how it is you go into work in a situation where you're never going to be able to do enough. You're not going to be able to change things to where everything is okay. You might be able to help a little bit if you're really careful and you're really graceful. And that's what it was like for me from 83 until we got to about 2000, where we finally had some drugs that really worked. My best friend, it was too late for him. He was still alive at 2000, but he was too ill for those new medicines to help him.
If you don't mind me asking, what was his name?
William J. Kreidler. He wrote a best-selling book on nonviolence in the classroom. At his death, it was estimated that his book on nonviolence in the classroom was in 55,000 classrooms around the world.
Wow.
Quite an accomplishment. His speeches are collected on a website that can be found, and you can still hear his beautiful wisdom.
I'm just sitting under the weight of the grief and the tenderness and the resilience and the joy and abandonment and building of new community, all of that, just when I think of this song, The Ones Who Aren't Here.
ones who aren't here and won't be coming in late. Home all alone, and the family won't be coming out tonight. Wish I could know all the lovers and friends kept from gathering. I think of you now, the way you could go for all of us refugees. Telling myself and the family, my friends and the folks on the job, one by one, and it's never been easy, and me and everyone changed. The hugs and the tears when they show you their hearts, and some never speak again. Every pot off the wheel can't bear the kiln. Every love can't bear the pain. So let's have a kiss and a happy sad tear and a hug the whole circle round. For the one who's not here, for the hate and the fear, for laughter, for struggle, for life. Let's have a song here for me and for you, and the love that we cannot hide. Let's have a song for the one who's not here and won't be coming out tonight.
That was John Calvi in conversation with Dwight Dunstan. That segment comes to us from a recent episode of The Seed, Conversations for Radical Hope. It's a project of Pendle Hill. You can find The Seed wherever you get your podcast or online at pendlehill.org/podcast. To learn more about John's healing work and his writing, visit johncalvi.com. I've also placed links to his work and to The Seed in our show notes over at quakerstoday.org. Ryan La Sala is amazing because he's a writer, writes young adult fiction, often, not always, in the horror genre. Most recent book is very gooky. The manifestation of the horror is very visceral and gooey.
That's true.
And so when people ask you these days, what do you do? What's your go-to answer?
That I'm a horror novelist and that I spend all of my time alone with my cat, just sitting in a room thinking the most horrific things I can think and then writing them down.
That's sweet.
Yeah, I really need so much therapy and I'm really not getting enough. Let me tell you that.
What are some identities that you have that you would like people to know about?
I am queer. I use he, they pronouns. I consider myself gender fluid. I'm a huge weeb. I love anime and video games. And the big lamentation of my life is that I don't have more time to play a lot of the expansive games that have come out. recently because I'm too busy writing.
Good. Writing. You're a writer.
If I wasn't writing books, I would be doing storytelling some other way.
And you've written a very queer, very horror-driven book, your newest book. So for you, what do horror and queerness share in common?
I really couldn't disentangle them because if I had to write the genre of my own life growing up, like there's a lot of joy there and a lot of queerness and a lot of theatricality, but I would have to shelve it in horror because it was defined by a sense that I was being stalked by a monster that I couldn't really even see, right? And many queer people have to commingle their joy and their victory and their triumph with a sense that at any moment something horrific could happen to them. And a large part of why we have community is because we need sanctuary and we sort of provide that to one another.
Mm.
It's a little bit familiar to me to kind of put characters into these positions.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, the characters I don't think would make it to the end or be able to be as fantastic as they are if they weren't queer, if they weren't approaching problem solving through a queer lens. So The Dead of Summer, right, it takes place on this queer community haven called Anchor's Mercy. These places, they exist, right? Like Provincetown is the version that I was sort of familiar with. The tourism's good for the economy of these places, but there is sort of this like sense of invasion. And so that's why when writing this book, especially a book about contagion and outbreak, I didn't want the queer community to sort of be saddled with the stigma of, causing this, right? And so ultimately, the community does take measures to stop the spread of something in their community, but it's the bachelorettes who resist and defy the stay-at-home order because they've got to have their karaoke and they're the birthday girl and, what have you, right? That entitlement to these spaces, and it ends up imperiling everybody. Ollie, the main character, he's born and raised on this island and has kind of watched his mom time and time again put on this big show every summer for people. And now she's sick. And Ollie thinks that there's something about the island that is making just the townies sick, just the people who can't leave it. His journey is figuring out what that could mean and how to get to the bottom of it and how to sort of take those secrets that are kind of rotting beneath the soil and pry them to the surface.
And you have been calling it an eco horror.
Yes. Ecological horror, it's not just that there's something in the water kind of rising out of the ocean to spread across the land. I'm also talking about like the ecology of communities and how like the ecology of like a queer community has to deal with its own types of invasions. Eco horror often sort of looks at mankind's balance against nature and sort of when it's pushed a little bit too far and when nature lashes back out.
There's so many things I really love about The Dead of Summer. I love maybe because I'm an old queen myself, the characterizations of the older queer folks on the island.
Yeah. You don't see that many depictions of like intergenerational queerness all in the same story, right? I wanted to set down a cast of characters where you've got generations. Even when those generations are gone, right, you're able to access their stories. A lot of these generations had to make really hard decisions in order to just survive past that particular point. Part of Ollie's story, at least for me in this, is coming to terms with the hard decisions that people before him had no choice but to make so that a sanctuary like his could survive to the point that he's able to sort of take that torch, make the same sort of hard decisions and kind of hopefully keep this place alive and available for future generations.
For Americans, especially groups of marginalized people, we're living in a contemporary horror story, right? Mass migrations, anti-trans rhetoric and legislation, incredible climate change denial, reversal. So why write horror genre when life is so frightening?
Because life is so frightening, because we need the ability to talk about the things that scare us. And some people find it really hard to kind of look directly at things and monsters that don't necessarily have a face. But if you hold up the dark mirror of a horrific story, it gives a focal point to start to address things that are malignant in our own world too. And hopefully it gives us some bravery and some idea of how we might also endure or might also survive to the other side. If you're looking at the cover, you're going to notice that there is this really sort of beautiful coral bursting out of a human-like figure. That's intentional. I chose something sort of pelagic in nature, something Cnidarian is the specific section of taxonomy where you'll find like jellyfish and sea anemones and corals because they are an animal but they require symbiosis. They require a really delicate and elegant balance between themselves and their own ecosystems, that when that's tilted one way or another, they can either grow out of control or they can bleach and whiten and vanish. I wanted to create something kind of delicate and kind of beautiful that is still scary, that is still monstrous. Something we haven't really seen. I mean, when people read or write about like zombies or things that come back from the dead, it's always the same colors, right? But I wanted to create something kind of bejeweled and encrusted and oceanic that felt completely new, yet a little bit familiar at the same time.
And a bit snotty, too, at first.
They're called weepers in the book, if you're curious. And Ollie's got a sadness in him that he really can't keep inside any longer when the book begins. The monsters that he ends up confronting are sort of these like weeping, ecstatic beings.
And you can potentially touch the ooze, but if it enters one of your orifices, your eyes, your mouth, whatever, you're infected, which reminded me about how horror movies in the 90s had a lot to do with body fluids. As we were dealing with the HIV/AIDS crisis, so many of the scariest creatures were oozy.
Yeah. Vector for contagion that is based in tears that kind of drown you from the inside out, to me, sort of began as a metaphor, but it definitely has real world inspiration.
Awesome. Anything you want to add before we end this lovely conversation?
This has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for having me.
That was Ryan La Sala speaking about his eco-horror novel, The Dead of Summer. I read it. I love it. Get it. Learn more at ryanlasala.com. We're nearing the close of this episode, and you are about to hear audio from the most delightful folk dancing experience I ever witnessed. But first, I have recommendations for you. There are many voices of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, non-binary, queer, and plus people that I could not include in today's show. So I encourage you to look at the March 2026 issue of Friends Journal. It is available for free online at friendsjournal.org. And here is some of what you will find in it. Miko Sorrell shares a lifelong journey of gender nonconformity, moving from a 1950s childhood to finding peace in an identity that is both and rather than either or. Ted Heck and Jim Fussell look at the stories of trans and intersex friends, showing how living one's gender truth is a profound act of Quaker integrity. Michelle Downey challenges meetings to move beyond just tolerating LGBTQ plus neighbors and instead start treasuring them as a vital part of the community. Petra Doan introduces the Queerness Committee, reimagining the traditional clearness process to help trans friends celebrate their identity as a gift from the spirit. Brian Blackmore uncovers the forgotten history of the Civilian Readjustment Committee. I had never heard of it, and I'm so glad I read the article. It's a story in which Quakers protected gay men from imprisonment as far back as the 1950s. Esther Mambo explores the struggle in African Quakerism to balance inherited missionary rules with the fundamental Quaker value of equality. To find these articles and more, visit friendsjournal.org. I also have a special music recommendation, and it beautifully complements the themes of today's show. I've been listening to the album Laughter in Summer by the Black trans music pioneer Beverly Glenn Copeland and his wife and creative partner, Elizabeth. Their music has a quality very similar to John Calvi's. It's gentle, it's deeply moving, and it carries this tender spiritual weight. This particular album is powerful because it chronicles their decade-long love story. It also serves as a beautiful correction to history by highlighting Elizabeth's vital contributions to Glenn's artistic legacy, which have often been overlooked. In a world that can feel fragmented, their collaboration is a testament to the enduring power of partnership and the ways in which love can be a form of creative resistance. I highly recommend spending some time with their work. Look for Beverly Glenn Copeland's Laughter in Summer wherever you listen to music. I have a link in our show notes at Quakers Today. Thank you so much for listening to this very queer episode of Quakers Today. Season 5 of Quakers Today has been sponsored by Friends Fiduciary. Friends Fiduciary unites Quaker values with expert investing. They serve more than 460 organizations with ethical portfolios, shareholder advocacy, and a deep commitment to justice and sustainability. Friends Fiduciary blends Quaker values with smart, mission-driven investing. With a 100% Quaker board, they help over 25 faith-based groups invest ethically and affordably. Join over 460 organizations investing with integrity. Learn more at friendsfiduciary.org. Season 5 has also been sponsored by the American Friends Service Committee. The American Friends Service Committee works at the forefront of social change to meet urgent needs, challenge injustice, and build peace. Did you know AFSC helped thousands of Jewish and non-Jewish refugees during World War II resettle in the U.S.? Today, AFSC works toward a future where everyone can thrive, has access to legal status, and is safe from detention and deportation. Learn how you can take action for immigrant safety, dignity, and well-being at afsc.org/stronger-immigrants. Learn more about other initiatives and actions at afsc.org. Season 6 will begin next month, and the entire season will focus on Quakers and money. Joining me as guest host will be Diana Yanez.
Capitalism asks us to pretend that profit is the only thing that motivates any of us. And I remember having this conversation with a venture capitalist about the runoff when you're having industrial waste and it goes into a river. And he looks at me with like this kind of blank face and he's like, oh, those are externalities.
Externalities, yeah.
I wanted to scream.
The love of money is the root of all evil. And if you look at almost every ecological disaster, almost always is because someone didn't take responsibility to clean up the mess that they made. Sweet Mish is spreading their wings into some new ventures. And Sweet Mish, you're going to be sorely missed. And hopefully you will pop by and visit us from time to time. Thank you for your many contributions as a co-host and co-producer. And thank you for listening to this very queer episode of Quakers Today. Stick around to hear answers to our monthly question and to learn about next month's question. In a moment, you will hear answers to the question, if you received a thank you note from the future, what would they be thanking you for? But first, as we look ahead to season 6, we're preparing to talk about money. We're curious. What insights or practices guide your relationship with finance today? Think about your home life, your meeting, or your work. Where did you find a better way to think about money? And what does that look like in practice? The question again, what insights or practices guide your relationship with finance today? Leave a voice memo with your name and the town where you live. The number to call is 317-Quakers. That's 317-782-5377. 7 Quakers. +1 if you're calling from outside the USA. And you can also send us an email. Send those emails to podcast@friendsjournal.org. That's podcast@friendsjournal.org. Or you could also leave a comment at Instagram or on TikTok. I have all these contact details in our show notes over at quakerstoday.org. All right, so here are answers to last month's question. If you received a thank you note from 100 years in the future, what are they thanking you for? Our first answer comes from an email. Dear Teacher Margaret, I am holding my 2-year-old grandson, AD, the 5th. Thank you for providing a sheltering wing, caring ear, and advocating for my grandfather when he was 9 and his family was in turmoil. When asked about the people who had helped him to live a good life and work to heal the earth, my grandfather included you. He told me you predicted that he would blow up the world or save it. Because of you, my grandson is here and has a better world to live in than my grandfather did. Sincerely, AD, III. And from TikTok, we received the following responses. Our first is from Bear Clover C, who says, thanks for planting native plants, buying secondhand, keeping my dogs on a leash, and staying on the trail while hiking, minimizing waste, donating to PBS, NPR, and wildlife rescues, volunteering for wilderness trail restoration. Diana Deluxe writes, standing up to federal tyranny in Minnesota and protecting neighbors. Roman A writes that I was a good mom. That's all I care about. I had a horrible mom myself. Daniel Cummings wrote, not giving up. Blue Ariel Silk, standing up for Ukraine. And an anonymous user, planting trees and milkweed. Thanks again. I look forward to seeing you soon.